In this lesson, we're going to be looking at converting between decimals, fractions, and percents. So it's a lot. If you're taking the notes, there is a foldable piece, and then the directions are cut out, and you're going to glue them behind the windows, and then write some examples of each ones. So, with no further ado, let's start with how do we convert a percent to a fraction? Here are the instructions, and you will find this if you're taking the notes, and you can glue it behind this flap. Rewrite the percent over 100. Remember that percents are always over 100. So no matter what the number is, just write it over 100 and then simplify it. So as an example, you could write this, 42%. Whatever the percent is, you're going to write it over 100. So that would be 42 100ths. And then both of those numbers are divisible by 2. And if we divide both by 2, we end up with 21 50ths. 108%. Sometimes the percent is more than 100, but you're still going to always write it over 100. So that would be 108 100ths. And then when we simplify and we divide them both by, I believe, 4, you're going to get 27 25ths. And we can leave it as a simplified improper fraction. So percents to fractions, just write the number over 100 and simplify. How do we convert a fraction to a decimal? So unless the fraction, the denominator of the fraction, can be mentally converted into tenths, hundreds, or thousandths, you can basically just take your calculator and divide the numerator by the denominator. For example, in the fraction 4/5. Now this is one that I could do mentally because I know that fifths can be turned into tenths, and with decimals we have tenths, and we have hundredths, and we have thousandths. And so if you can turn them into a decimal of tenths, hundredths, and thousandths, we can do it mentally. And if I turn that into tenths, which is times 2 on the denominator, and I multiply times 2, that would be 8 tenths, and I can write that as the decimal 8 tenths, which is 8 tenths. Now, if you don't want to do that mentally, or you don't know how to do that mentally, you can take your calculator, and with this fraction bar right here means divided by, so that basically says 4 divided by 5, and you would get 8 tenths. 3/8, you divide 3/8 with your calculator, or if you have memorized the eighths, which are all counting by 125, so you count by 125 3 times, it would be 375 thousandths. But this is one that you may want to do with your calculator. How do we convert a decimal to a percent? Once you have the decimal, what we want to do is multiply the decimal times 100. Anytime you're multiplying a number times 100, you're moving the decimal 2 places to the right. That's all you're doing when multiplying times 100. And then you add the percent sign. So if you have this, 75 hundredths, you're moving the decimal 2 places to the right. If you were to type into your calculator 75 hundredths times 100, it's going to be the same thing as moving the decimal 2 places to the right, and it is simply 75, and then you add the percent sign, 75%. Our next example, 1 1800ths. Again, same directions. We move the decimal 2 places to the right, which is multiplying times 100, and put a percent sign at the end, and it would simply be 118%. So here are a couple of examples if you want to write inside your flap next to where you put the instructions for how to do this. Next one, how to convert a percent to a decimal. We're going to do the same thing we just did in reverse. Instead of adding a percent sign, we're going to remove the percent sign. This time we want to divide by 100. When you divide by 100, you see the 2 zeros? You're moving the decimal 2 places to the left in the opposite direction. So let's look at an example here. If we have 42%, first you remove the percent sign, that would be 42. Right now the decimal is at the end. If you move it 2 places to the left, you would have 42 hundredths. That is taking that number and dividing it by 100. 350%, right now the decimal is at the end. If you move it 2 places to the left and remove the percent sign, you would have 3 5/10. So sometimes it's going to be larger than a whole. It's going to be more than 1. How do we convert a fraction to a percent? Well, now we're going to take the steps that we just did and add them together. First, we have to convert the fraction to a decimal, which we've already talked about. Then we have to change the decimal into a percent by, again, multiplying by 100 or moving it 2 places to the right. So it's like the steps we've already talked about, but putting them all together. 1/8, to turn that into a decimal, you would take your calculator and go 1 divided by 8. Or if you know eighths, you're counting by 125 one time, which is 125 thousandths. There's your decimal. To turn the decimal into a percent, we multiply times 100 or move the decimal over 2 places, and it would be 12.5%. For the fraction 2/3, if you do that with your calculator, you will see that it is a repeating fraction, or a repeating decimal, I'm sorry. And then if you move the decimal 2 places to the right, you would have 66 and a repeating 6. And we have learned that when we have a repeating decimal, we can either use the repeat line to show which decimal is repeating, or you can simply round the decimal to the nearest tenth. So I rounded it to the nearest tenth, but either way will be correct. Okay, to convert a decimal to a fraction, you're going to read the decimal. If you read decimals and fractions, they read the same way. So if you read the decimal correctly, you write that fraction and you simply simplify. We're not going to read this as 0.75. We're going to read it as 75 hundredths, because with 2 numbers in the decimal, we have hundredths. So we say the number 75. Then we say the place value where the last digit is, which is in the hundredths place. So that says 75 hundredths, which is easy to write as a fraction, 75 100ths. And then both of those numbers are divisible by 25, and that would give us 3/4. So if you read decimals correctly, they read just like a fraction, and you can write them and simplify them. This reads as 2 3/10. This is in the tenths column, so we read it 2 3/10, 2 wholes and 3/10. Whatever comes before the decimal is just a whole number right here. 2 3/10 is already simplified, so we're finished. Okay, now let's just look at this and see kind of how they all come together and are similar. These are a box with 100 squares. It's a 10 by 10. And we're going to look at how many of the boxes are shaded. Well, since I know this is a 10 by 10, I know there's 10 here, I know there's 10 here, 30, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 38 squares. So how many squares are there? 38. Okay, now the question is, so what is the fraction? Well, there's 100 squares altogether, and there were 38 shaded, so we know it's 38 100ths. And then we've learned that when we write a fraction, we always simplify it. Both of these numbers are divisible by 2. And so when you divide both of those by 2, you would get 19/50. So how do you write the same thing as a decimal? To write as a decimal, you have to go back to the fraction that was over 100. Okay, 38 hundredths reads just like a decimal. 38 hundredths written as a decimal is 0.38, 38 hundredths. And then write as a percent. You take your decimal and you move the decimal 2 places to the right, and it would be 38%. Okay, how many squares? There are 100 squares there. There's always going to be 100 squares there. And then how many are shaded? Here we have 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 squares are shaded. So what is our fraction for that? That would be 16 hundredths. Both of those numbers are divisible by 4. And when you divide them both by 4, you would have 4/25 as a simplified fraction. But as a decimal, remember our fraction was 16 hundredths. It reads exactly the same way as a decimal. So 16 hundredths would be 0.16. And to write that as a percent, you just move the decimal over 2 places and it would be 16%. Okay, we know there's 100 squares. How many are shaded? 10, 20, 30, 42. So that would be, as a fraction, 42 hundredths, which simplifies to 21 fiftieths. But it was 42 100ths, which we can write this as a decimal, which is just 0.42. And then to convert it to a percent, you move the decimal over 2 places, and it would be 42%. Okay, we have 10, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This time we have 37 shaded out of 100. 27, I'm sorry, I said 37. 27 shaded out of 100. So our fraction would be 27 hundredths. That cannot be simplified. 27 hundredths reads the same way as a decimal, which would be 0.27. And to convert it to a percent, you simply move the decimal over 2 places, and it would be 27%. Now this one, if we say how many boxes are there, there's actually 400. But how many are shaded? Well, we have 100 shaded here, 100 shaded here, 100 shaded here, 10, 20, 30, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 335 boxes that are shaded. So when we write that as a fraction, we're going to write 335. We're still going to write it over 100. I know that you're looking up there and you're seeing, well, there's actually 400. But we're always going to write it over 100 because it's based on that. And then both of those are divisible by 5. And when you simplify that, it's 67 twentieths. Now, when you take the fraction 335 hundredths and you write that as a decimal, 335 hundredths. If you look up here, you'll notice that there are 3 holes that are shaded. 3 squares. There's where we get the 3 holes that are shaded. And then on the one that we have part of it shaded, there's 35 out of 100, which is 35 hundredths. So that is 3 and 35 hundredths. It's a lot of drawing there. To write that as a percent, you simply move the decimal over 2 places, and that would be 335%. Now this one's tricky. Look up here. We have 100 squares are still. How many are shaded? Well, there's only a fourth of one shaded. See this right up here? If you divided this into 4 equal parts, 1/4 of it is shaded, and 1/4 written as a decimal is 25 hundredths. So I wrote it as a decimal. I said 25 hundredths is shaded. So to write that as a fraction, we write 25 hundredths out of 100 squares. Now remember from a couple of lessons ago that we cannot have a decimal in the numerator. We have to get rid of it. So we're going to move the decimal over 2 places, which is multiplying times 100. And if you do that on top, you have to also do that on the bottom. So we're going to move the decimal over 2 places, which is the same as adding 2 zeros. So it would be 25 10,000ths. Both of those numbers are divisible by 25. And when you simplify that, you're going to get 1/400ths. Now, go back to our fraction. It was 25 hundredths over hundredths. 25 hundredths over hundredths. So how do we write that as a decimal? This one's tricky. Remember that when we moved the decimal over 2 places, it was 25. And we added 2 zeros, which made it 10,000. This fraction reads 25 10,000ths. So we write the number 25 10,000ths. This is tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths. So this is the 10,000ths column. So we write the number 25 and we make sure that the last digit is in the 10,000ths column. How do we write that as a percent? We again do the same thing by moving the decimal 2 places to the right, and it actually be 25 hundredths percent. There's actually a decimal in this percent. A little bit tricky. Okay, look at this one. How many squares are there? There's 100. How many are shaded? There are 3 1/2 shaded. So I put 3 and 5/10. Now to write that as a fraction, again, we have 3 and 5/10 that are shaded out of 100. We have to get rid of this decimal. We move it over one place, which would be 35, which means we have to add 1 0, which would be thousandths. So this says 35 thousandths. Both of those numbers are divisible by 5 to simplify the fraction, and that would be 7/200ths. But to write the decimal, this said 35 thousandths. So we know that we're going to have the 5 in the thousandths column, which means we're going to write it as 0.035. And then to convert it to a percent, we move the decimal over two places, and that would be 3 and 5/10%. And that is our lesson on lots of conversions. I hope that was helpful.